Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Awesome. Grateful to be here, Rory, and thank you, our listener, for joining us. This is episode 181 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. On our episode today, we're going to be starting with our student check-in, where we bring something relevant to a student. There'll be training on a formal course to become a counsellor. We're going to be looking at stages in a counselling relationship. It's also good, I think, Rory, to revisit that as a qualified practitioner and recognise that it's not an activity, but it does have its stages that we go through. We then go into the digital counselling revolution, and today we're going to be looking at referrals in online counselling, how they differ from face-to-face, and they do considerably. And then in practice matters, where we take a little bit of information from what might present to a qualified therapist. We're going to be having a lecture, and it's going to be about applying neuroscience in your practice, and we have Maggi McAllister-MacGregor that is going to be our expert on that, and Rory, you caught up with her. So great episode 181. Let's start off with stages in a counselling relationship.
Yes, I think it's one of the things that is asked a lot, certainly at certain times of the year when students are thinking about maybe recording their skills, maybe recording their advanced skills. A lot of awarding bodies and indeed universities ask students to think about the stages of a counselling relationship. And I always used to say to my students, you know, the opening of a counselling relationship is like the opening of a play. The curtains come back, you know, the protagonists, I'm going to use a theatrical term, the protagonists enter the stage left and right. They sit in front of each other, and then it begins. And I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that there's a certain amount of art in counselling. You know, yes, we look at the research and the science, and there's a lot of emphasis on that. But actually, counselling is as much an art. And that art, I think, really does show when we're thinking about how the relationships develop and the stages of it. So if we think of, you know, an initial a beginning of a therapeutic relationship, or indeed a skills encounter, what happens in that initial stage? What happens? Well, the first thing, of course, is that there is a sense of meeting each other. Martin Buber, the philosopher, talked about the I and thou. And I think we could translate that to me and you, like me and Ken are sat here, me and you, just me and you, no one else. And that's the start of it. It comes into the skill of rapport, but it's also very much the opening of the play, you know, the opening where you know, both of the people are waiting for something to happen. And usually what happens is that at the beginning of any therapeutic encounter, before therapy takes place, there's usually a contract drawn up, some form of contract, Ken.
Yeah, and I guess when you step back and look at the 3,000-foot view of the stages in counselling, we're keeping it really simple here. We're going to go beginning, middle, end. That just keeps it really easy, the three sections. But so much fits into those three sections. I like how you were kind of relating it to the beginning of a play, Rory. And if you think about it, by the time you sit down to watch the play, you've already been through a process. So that process starts when you think about going to the play, and you think about, might go online and look what plays are on and booking your tickets. And we recognize that within a client's relationship, the same is true with counseling. When they sit down in our therapy room, that is not the beginning of the relationship. That relationship has already started forming from when they maybe made that first contact with us. They started a conversation. They would have done that because they have a want or a need within their own life. They may have found us via our website. They may have found us via a referral. They may have found us via their local service or agency that they're engaging in. So we recognize that there is a pre-meeting us phase of that relationship. When the relationship starts within the counselling room, it has its own process that would start off. And you're speaking there about the contract, Rory, where we basically start, before delving into any therapeutic work, laying out what this therapeutic work is going to look like. And what's really interesting with the contracting is it acknowledges the final stage of counselling, the end. So within your contract, you're going to be speaking about what that end looks like. And examples of that may be, if you're working in an agency and you only have 6 sessions that you can offer that client, you might be saying, I'm mindful that we only have 6 sessions. So you're talking about the end right at the beginning. So the beginning, the middle, and the end, the 3 definitive sections, kind of flow and work together. Also, you contract, and then the next part of that beginning phase is building a relationship. And if you think about a play, there's a warm-up. They're going to have something at the beginning that's going to capture your attention, that's going to get you engaged. And the same is true of counselling. We can't expect that a client would walk in and form an instant trusting bond with us. We're a complete stranger. So we go through a process of building rapport, using our counselling skills, using our way of being to create a relationship where the client feels that they're safe to bring what they need to bring.
Absolutely, Ken. And if we labour the point slightly of the play, you know, the times I've been to see a play, I don't go and see a lot of plays, but there's always usually somebody in the foyer who's either had a friend who's seen it, or alternatively has read about it and wants to tell everybody what the play involves.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can see a lot of grumpy people saying, I wish this person had shut up. I've not come to hear your interpretation of it. I've come to see the players. Now, if we think about that, and a lot of people who go to the see films, go to the movies, have had that same thing. The same thing happens in counselling relationships. Before you actually sit down, you walk in the client to the room, you know, in the confidential space. Sometimes the client will start telling you about their story. So I think it's really important to think about when a client does that, to be respectful, to be thoughtful, but to realize that the story really only unfolds when you're together, when you're sat in front of each other. And here's the thing, the beginning of the relationship is absolutely crucial. Get this wrong and the relationship will not develop. It will not mature. And part of a good opening, I think, a good beginning, is building trust. That's what the contract's for. The contract's about building trust. It's about helping a client feel safe, know they're listened to, letting the client really, really, really get a sense of who you are too. You might have only met very briefly before, if you're a student in practice. So they're trying to get the sense of who you are. Can I trust this person? Who does this? You might remind them of someone in your past. So in their past. So it really is a trust building exercise. And I think once that phase is beginning, once that act, as we would say in the theatre, has opened, then we go to the kind of the main part of the play, which is the client's material, the middle. And that is where you're exploring the issues that the client has, where the client is speaking about what's going on for them, you know, how that's affecting, they're talking about their emotions, and you're reflecting back, you're picking up on themes, you're getting a sense of who this client is and what their difficulties. And most importantly, they are getting a sense that you understand them, that they are being heard.
Oh, yeah, it's so important. You've laid that groundwork. You've created that trusting environment where that client now feels safe to bring their story, their material, their true emotions, sharing things sometimes that they've never shared with another human being ever. And that is a privileged place for us to be. And as we're in that center section, so we've been through that beginning, we're now in the middle. This is where we really get into the counseling skills, and we would bring in the more advanced counseling skills. We might introduce a little bit of challenge. Now, we would be gentle with challenge in those early phases, but we might, now that the relationship has been built, introduce a little bit of challenge. In fact, challenge, if we look to the person-centered approach to counseling, is important because we speak about an incongruence where the person feels one way inside, but they may present or show a different part of themselves outside. And it creates that incongruence, that mismatch from what I feel to what I show. And challenge would be saying, I see that you present this way, but you're saying you feel this way. And that is a gentle challenge. And that is within a relationship that has been formed, where there is some trust that is formed. And then we might go to the more advanced skills like immediacy, where we're bringing ourselves, we're sharing part of ourselves. And if you were interested in immediacy, just go to counsellingtutor.com and put in a search. We've got a little search box there for immediacy, and we've got lots of information on that. But that's a more advanced counseling skill that would only be used once the relationship has been developed in that middle to end part of the counseling process.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And let's not forget a very underrated skill in this middle stage, and that is the use of silence. Part of this middle stage is the client processing what's going on, trying to understand the shift in perception, the shift in themselves as they're being heard, and they're starting to be able to take control of their lives. And sometimes that is about those moments of silence where you're sat in front of the person, both completely present in the room, but both silent, as the client contemplates the changes, the shift in perception. And this is a really rich area. This is the part of the play where if there was an audience, they would be really getting involved. They would be literally on the stage with you, experiencing that. And that is a real crucial element. I mean, that's what counselling is all about. And then, as that takes hold, a sense of the end scene appears.
Yeah. It does, Rory. And if we think about it, the end scene, as you referred to it there, Rory, it started in the first scene. In the beginning phase, we mentioned when the end might come. And that can be linked to a number of sessions, or it could be linked to what the client is bringing. When you say, what is it you're looking to get out of therapy? You may find within that middle section that they start to show that they've hit their therapeutic goal, the reason that they came in. You're going to see the indicators that show you that end scene is coming along. And when we get to the end scene, as in the beginning, we started by referencing and acknowledging the end scene. When we get to the end scene, we go back to the beginning and acknowledge the beginning. We might go back and say, when we first got together, we mentioned that we only had 6 sessions, and I'm mindful now we only have 2 sessions left. So you're going back to the beginning, to the contract. Or you may suggest, when you came in, you suggested you wanted to get this and that out of counselling. And I recognize now through our sessions that you're feeling that you've kind of got there and we're approaching the end. And what we don't do, of course, is go, well, thank you very much. You've got what you came for. It's session 6 now. Thank you. Goodbye. Turn off the light. Let's go. Very sudden, bang, abrupt ending. It is something that is acknowledged. And ending is a process. It's part of the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's a process in itself. So an end is not a stopping. It is an acknowledgement of the process that you've been through together and pointing forward to what is coming, to allow the client the time and the space to process what has happened for them. And as we go into that ending, we realize that it's not just the ending of therapy for them. It's the ending of a relationship that they have formed, a trusting relationship, because we started with building that relationship, bringing in our skills to create that rapport, and that's coming to an end.
Absolutely. And, I think a celebration is sometimes in counselling, we don't look at the celebration aspects of what we do. Sitting in front of the client at the end of this journey, as we're coming to the final curtain, to keep the analogy of the play going. And what happens is that you both acknowledge the work done. You may acknowledge the work that needs to be done. You may not. This may be just one chapter in the book of a client's life, and there may be another play that plays out on another stage with another therapist. But acknowledging the work done, and then saying a warm goodbye. The protagonists leave the stage, leaving just the empty chairs.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. Beautifully said, Rory. And you mentioned celebration, and I think that's something that is not often visited in the therapeutic process. Therapy is maybe thought of as something that is sad, hard work, a lot of negative emotion, but it can also be really, really positive. And we celebrate with a client if they find themselves in a position to celebrate, because we walk alongside them in the same way as we share and walk with them when they're having difficulty. We celebrate with them. And it would be great, it would be ideal if every therapy set kind of started with a beginning, went through a middle, and then in the ending there was this beautiful sunset going down, and the birds were singing, and the client was leaving going, well, that's all that sorted. But we also recognize that it's not always that way. Could be that you have a limited amount of sessions, and that the client is bringing can't be covered in depth in those limited amount of sessions, and that the client may be going away with bits missing. And we recognize that part of the ending is also holding the future journey of the client. In the same way as we recognize the processes and the end not being a fast ending, we recognize that the part of the ending, when they leave, we still have an element of duty, of care to that client in terms of referrals. If they still have unresolved issues, are we referring them on? Are we kind of guiding them, at least giving them a map of where they might go next, which is interestingly what we're going into in our next section.
It is. And I think it's a really useful discussion, beginnings, middles and ends. It comes up a lot in the mailbag when people ask questions, people doing their level 3 skills, level 4 skills, even those folks at university. And also it appears on our Facebook group quite a lot. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, little opportunity for a little plug, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door, we're going to let you in, and you're going to be in an area with thousands of like-minded people, all of which love the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We've got students, we've got qualified colleagues, we've got supervisors, we've got a soup song of tutors, all talking about the different modalities in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So if you're not in, knock on the door, come in and join the party.
As we reverse out of our student check-in, we stick with the theme of that continuation, and we look at the digital counselling revolution, where we acknowledge that the digital world now plays a part in how counselling is delivered, how counselling is received by our clients. And today we're going to be speaking about how referrals differ when working online.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Yes, one of the interesting aspects of online counselling is the fact that we are not tethered to one single geographical location. And I thought, when I think about when I started my journey as a counsellor, I worked just down the road from where I live in Ashton-under-Lyne in the north of England. And my whole counselling world was about 2 square miles. People would come from 2 or 3 square miles to mind, ask for help, and they would be referred. And here's the thing, all the referral agencies were in the same 2 or 3 miles, maybe 5 miles. So we knew them all. In fact, some of them would pop in for a cup of tea and say, we're offering this service, and can you tell your counselling staff? And that was great. And everybody had a little, what we used to call a little book of referrals with all the addresses in, and so we could help. And that worked really well. And it still works very well. But when we talk about online counselling, we have to realise that, our world has got just a whole lot bigger. And, I was speaking to a colleague yesterday who's based in the north of England, who's got a client in Kent, which is about 150 miles away. So what happens if that client needs a referral? No longer can you look in your local area in your little book. You really do need to be set up with a way of referring a client if they're not in your geographical location. And really, that takes a bit of planning, Ken.
It does. And it's recognizing not only maybe giving the client a link of where they can go and what they can access. It may be that we need to make the referral, and it may be that within your practice that you might already have existing roadways, pathways into your local services. You might be able to, for example, say, oh, if a client brings a certain presentation, I know what you need to do. You need to speak to Jean at such an agency. That's what they deal with. And that we do in our face-to-face practice, because we build the relationships and we build the referral networks. When we're working with clients online, we're now trying to refer into suitable services that are within the client's geographical location. It's not possible for us to know all of those services. It's not possible for us to know who the contact people are within those services, or what the referral pathways, what information they need, what forms they need. So it can sometimes require a little bit of extra homework. It can sometimes require that if a client brings a certain presentation, that you might need to say, let me see what I can find for you on that, and go and do a bit of research online, maybe reach out and slowly start building your new black book of referrals that can be made online. Some services online are national, so you can refer nationally, and those are pretty easy, and you can take time to go online, do a little bit of searching, and find what you can get there. In our formal course, we offer a certificate in online and telephone counselling course, and part of the course is that we work with our students on the course to develop their online book, and some of them come in pretty extensive. So if you do the research, the services are out there. But it brings up the next point. So once you've found the services, you then need to share a little bit of the client's information, potentially. How is that done? Because you're unlikely to have confidentiality agreements with the service that you are referring into. So I guess it starts with speaking with your client, finding out how comfortable they are for you to contact the service or agency on their behalf, and then refer to what is known as the Caldecott principles, which you can tell us a bit about, Rory.
Yes, well, the Caldecott principles were developed in 1997 by Dame Fiona Caldecott, and it was generated from a very, very tragic case of a young child who sadly died at the hands of relatives. And there was an opportunity in lots of cases for the professionals the child was involved with. It was Victoria Climbier, to pick up on this. But for some reason, they got an idea that they couldn't share information. And as a consequence, the information wasn't shared. And there was a general lack of communication. And sadly, a young child died in fairly horrific circumstances. So in 1997, Dame Fiona Caldecott chaired a review, and she came up initially with 6 principles. There are 7 now. And they were basically principles that professionals adhere by. So every professional, be they a medical professional, be they a mental health professional, even your dentist, would abide by these. And basically, they are a checklist of how we share information. And it starts with the first one: justify the purpose for using confidential information. So if you need to share information with another professional, you need to really justify it. You need to make defensible decision making. Why are we sharing this information? How is it in benefit of, and they use the term patient here, but in counselling, with the client. And once you have justified that, then you can go on to the second principle, which is don't use data unless it's absolutely necessary. And the principles go through a set of checklists, if you like, until we come to the 7th principle, which is the duty to share information can be as important as the duty to protect confidentiality. And I think that's an interesting one. Sometimes when we talk about confidentiality, we talk about clients' autonomy and they have to be free to make their own decisions. That's true. But sometimes we have to act in the greater good, and we have to say, actually, I'm going to have to I'm going to have to contact a GP. There's a client who's he's got suicidal thinking, and he's well along the way of enacting a plan to end their own life. And sometimes what you have to do, if that's the case, is to use that principle. The duty to share information can be as important as the duty to protect client confidentiality. So I think if you are doing any form of referral, you can Google the Caldecott principles. The seven principles are the ones that are in use now, but really useful, certainly for complaints brought against you, or you have to justify your actions. You can evidence the Caldecott principles as what we would call defensible decision making.
And I guess the Caldecott principles have been in place for some time, as Rory outlined. Things have changed since those Caldecott principles came into effect. We now are speaking about sharing data online. So we can go through the Caldecott principles, but there is another legislation we need to look to, which is a general data protection regulation, which is a European regulation that came in and suggests how a personal data of an individual can be held, stored, and shared. And the basics of it is that a person's data cannot be shared without their implied permission. And implied permission is they can't tell you on the telephone that it's okay for you to share their data with another agency and you go, well, there you go, I've got your permission. Because if you needed to evidence that, you can't evidence it. There needs to be something, either a tick box that they have checked on maybe a form, or that they put it in writing. You need something to evidence back if you are sharing information. And again, going back to the Caldecott principles, you would only share the information needed. So if I'm just taking any example here, it's unlikely that you're going to send all of the client's notes unless you need to. You might just put over the presenting issue. You might not share the client's address if it is not necessary, but it may be if it's an area-based service. So it's about assessing each referral on its merit, on its needs, working to legislation, working in best service of the client to the Caldecott principles.
Absolutely. And I think what you say brings up an interesting aspect, Ken. Certainly when we're working online, may not always be possible for us to get the client to authorize sharing of information. You're working on the phone with the client and they say that they're in imminent risk of taking their own life. And you say, in our contract, I'm going to have to share this information with your GP, the emergency contact. In cases like that, of course, you cannot send a form that needs to be filled in. The perceived wisdom is make a contemporaneous note. Write it down. Write the time of the session, in your notes, a sense of what was discussed, the actions outlined. And again, if you're having to be called to account, a defensible decision would be, I really didn't have the time to send information to the client to get authorization. This was literally a life and death situation. And also, you can refer to your contract. If your contract has harm to self or harm to others in it, again, you're protected. But I think, Ken, it does highlight, doesn't it, the differences between making a referral in the room or face-to-face and making a referral when you're online, you're working either by telephone or video link.
Yeah, it does. And it highlights again the importance of formal training, getting the competences in place that you need to work online or via telephone if you are working using those digital mediums. Of course, we have a certificate in online and telephone counselling, and you can get information on that by just visiting counsellingtutor.com. We have a book that we put out on this very topic. I'm very pleased to say that within the first 24 hours of the book hitting Amazon, we reached the bestseller list and sold over 1,000 copies in 24 hours. So we know there is a need for this information. If you're interested in that book, again, counsellingtutor.com is where you can look for that. But again, those differences have to be recognized. And we could speak about it all day because it doesn't just end there. If you are now going down the route where you are you have permission to share that information. You're sharing it via an email or via a form that you're submitting to a different agency. Then there's also a duty of care to have a look at what their GDPR, how they handle the data as well, because you're handing it over. You're handing over, even with that client's permission, you're taking their data and you're handing it over to someone else. And it's just worth then looking, how do they handle that data? And there's just so many moving parts to it. I think we could talk about it all day.
Absolutely, Ken. And just to remind everyone, if you are working online or via telephone, and you're thinking about, well, how the heck do I develop this referral pathway? You know, do I spend all my time in search engines looking for things? If you go to 181, go to counsellingtutor.com first, look in the podcast tab, look for episode 181. We're going to put a useful link into a web page that shares lots of information geographically, so you can type in your town. This is only for the UK, so for those people in the rest of the world, I'm sorry, but we do have a UK one. You can type in Edinburgh, Glasgow, or London, and it will show the kind of services that are available, and you can make a referral there. So, counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab 181, and you can just find that link, and that might be of use to you.
There it is. That is the digital counselling revolution. We now move neatly on to Practice Matters, where today Rory met up with Maggi McAllister-MacGregor to speak about applying neuroscience in practice.
Practice Matters.
And we welcome Maggi McAllister-MacGregor, who has recently delivered a lecture for us on neuroscience. So welcome, Maggi, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Rory. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, neuroscience, how, in terms of our understanding of it, how long has it been around? Because when I started in the world of counselling, it was hardly talked about 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's been around for a while, but it's only maybe in the last couple of decades, Rory, that technology has advanced so much that we're actually now able to get a whole lot more information about what's going on in the brain. And, you know, with being able to do things like functional MRI scans, things like that. So really the technology in the last 2 decades has made a big difference. But there's still a huge amount that we don't know.
Yes, and it sounds to me like the technology has opened up an area of inquiry where, you know, you can understand some things, parts of the brain function can be understood, but others are still a bit of a mystery, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it still holds a lot of secrets that at the moment it's keeping to itself.
Yes. So that, I guess. So what do we know about the brain? What does modern neuroscanning and modern thinking tell us about how the brain works?
Well, I think what we're realizing a lot is about how the brain forms connections, how networks are set up and formed, how the different areas of the brain communicate with each other, so that's a big improvement in terms of how the actual brain communicates with other parts of the nervous system, but also the body as well. I think we're learning a lot more about the kind of brain-body connection as well, which of course is mediated through the vagus nerve. That is the brain-body link. That's probably the main areas and also finding out that the brain is actually quite plastic. It's capable of change throughout the lifespan. I mean, we used to think that change stopped in the brain, in about the 20s. But now we know that actually there can be new connections formed throughout the entire lifespan. So you can teach old dogs new tricks.
I was going to use the old dogs and new tricks analogy, and what I heard you say was that by understanding the brain, we also are getting a better understanding of how the connection to our body is. And you talked about the vagus nerve. What do we know from the research regarding the vagus nerve and how the brain is connected to the body by it. What do we know about, say, how trauma might manifest itself in a client?
Okay, well, we've learned a whole lot more about the vagus nerve through the polyvagal theory, which is a theory that Stephen Porges developed in sort of the early 90s, I think. And the main kind of contribution the polyvagal theory has brought is it's given us an explanation of our social behaviour in terms of the ventral part of the nerve, which is, in evolutionary terms, the most recently developed part of the nerve, and it's only found in mammals. So it is a recent evolutionary development. But also the other part of the nerve, the dorsal part, which gives us, which is actually quite relevant to trauma because it produces all of the kind of shutdown responses that we get. And trauma generally will put us into a defensive state. It will take us out of social engagement and put us into a defensive state, whether that's sympathetic activation or whether it's dorsal-vagal shutdown. So we're learning a lot about the impact that trauma can have on a person's perception of the world, how they experience the world, and how they react to the world. So we think it's very important that we understand that.
Yes, and in terms of the history of understanding this, it's a relatively new idea in psychological circles, isn't it? It was the 1980s, I think, when they recognised things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and it became a standalone presentation. Counsellors or psychotherapists who inform themselves of the information, polyvagal system, vagal nerve, how the brain works. How do you think they transfer that into practice? How is the knowledge of it useful when you're practicing with a client?
I think it can be useful in a couple of ways, Rory. There's obviously the psychoeducation side of it. So actually helping clients to understand what's going on within their system, within their bodies, can be a good starting point in terms of actually beginning to alleviate anxiety, because the more someone's able to understand something, the less scary it becomes. So that tends to reduce their anxiety, as just without doing anything else. But it's also it also can be used practically in the session when you're working with the client, because you might, as a therapist, you might notice some subtle changes in the state that the person's in terms of which part of the nervous system might be being activated. And again, being able to feed that information back to the client helps the client become more aware of what's happening within their own bodies and within their own nervous system. And of course, if you're not aware of something, you can't do anything about it. So bringing that awareness to the client can really be helpful for them to, again, understand more from an experiential place what's going on for them.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, because there's a huge amount of debate about not having the medical model in the therapy room, but actually working with what is a physiological model in the therapy room by using examples of direct experience can be mightily helpful. And certainly, as you say, clients may think they're going crazy, with what's going on. Explaining it to them, psychoeducation. Actually, that could be really, really useful. I mean, there's I can think of a few.
Yeah, absolutely. But it also does something else as well, Rory, which is when we talk about something with our clients, it actually engages the prefrontal cortex, which tends to move them back into their social engagement system, into that ventral part of the vagus. So they're much more able then to engage with the therapist. So you've got more psychological contact when your prefrontal cortex is engaged. So it's important from that perspective as well. And as you say, being able to understand something can help people make sense of their experiences. And especially things like when people react in ways that they might feel a bit ashamed about or embarrassed about or guilty about. For example, take the example of sexual assault. Often people will shut down and freeze when they're, in the middle of an assault, and helping them to understand that this is actually the nervous system's way of protecting them. Because quite often they'll say, well, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run away? Why didn't I, do some of those kinds of things? It can help, with that shame that goes along with that, when they can understand why they responded in the way that they did.
Absolutely. And, in my experience as a therapist, that can be such a weight lifted off a shoulder in that people just don't understand why they, in their words, allowed it to happen. But actually, the brain took executive control and tried to keep them as safe as possible. You spoke earlier about, we know a lot about how the brain works, but there are still mysteries it's yet to give up. Can you give us a taste of what we may want to find out in the future?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I've got the answer to it. I suppose that, that answer might be different for different people depending on what area they're interested in. But certainly I think, maybe things like being able to make computational models and things like that, where we can actually model something of how the brain processes things. That might be an area that's, might be worth developing, in terms of using computer science and neuroscience together to help understand a lot more of the processes. I think one of the things that makes it difficult to actually study the brain is there's very rarely only one area of the brain that activates at the same time. When you get activation in one bit, there's nearly always other areas of the brain involved and activated at the same time. So that complicates things. I think in terms of, things like systems theory, when you change one part of the system, even a small way, it affects the whole system. So it's difficult then maybe to maybe predict what outcomes are going to be if, when you make a change in one bit, because actually this, it can be affecting different networks, lots of different brain areas. So that adds to the complexity of, how we can study it, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that the brain is slowly, this complex bit of stuff we have between our ears is slowly giving up its secrets. And as you say, models. I can't spell computational. I've got my words mixed up today. But being able to predict, I'll use the word predict. Yeah. Predictive models may be very useful with some people who maybe have trauma, and you may be able to predict how that might affect them at different times of life. It's certainly a interesting and growing area of psychotherapy, and I think one that the therapists really need to embrace, no matter what modality. So, Maggi McAllister-MacGregor, thank you so much for taking your time today.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you, Rory, for hosting that interview, and a big thanks to Maggi McAllister-MacGregor. Applying neuroscience in practice, so much to consider there, and it just shows that taking psychological education, really delving in and learning about what is actually happening, can make such a difference. And don't forget that there is a lecture on this. If you're interested in the topic, Applying Neuroscience in Practice, a full lecture, which is available through the Counsellor CPD library. If you're interested in finding out more about that, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there.
Yes, and it's been a very varied podcast today. We started off with stages in the counselling relationship and talked about the theatre of counselling, the art of counselling, and then we moved on into looking at referrals in the online world. How do you refer to help the clients if your client is 100 miles away? And then finally, we caught up with Maggi McAllister-MacGregor, who gave us a really insightful really insightful observations about why understanding the neuroscience is important in counselling practice. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the online digital counselling revolution.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.